Hello, everybody. My name is Casey Jakubowski, PhD. I am a history of education expert, and also I am in rural schools in educational leadership. Today, I'm going to be talking about research into the master plan for school district reorganization, which is the current active policy in rural education reform in New York, and its historical implications for local historical societies, regional historical societies, and also for researchers. What I found when I was beginning to work on my master's in history degree at SUNY Binghamton was in rural communities where I was teaching in Delaware County, New York, and living in Chenango County, New York. There were a number of hyphenated schools, or 2 or 3 named schools. And having grown up in the suburban Western New York area, I didn't know what that meant. And so I began to explore into the history of how these hyphenated schools came to be. And what I discovered in my research is that there are a number of resources underutilized in smaller historical societies at the county and town and village level throughout New York. And what I also discovered is that the New York State Archives has a large number of resources that tell the history of local schools. Within the new standards for the 21st century framework for social studies teachers, and best practices for local historians, as well as those who are looking to discuss issues that have emerged on a local, regional, and national level in the areas of equity, education, and rural innovation, identity, and some of the politics that are moving throughout the country on a national level. Places to begin to look are these rural schools and their histories. So what is the root of the rural school reform movement? It actually begins in New York in 1812 with the creation of the textbook aid, as well as operating aid that was utilized throughout the state up until the late 1890s with the formalization of the Board of Regents and the University of the State of New York. With the creation of the Commissioner of Education position and Andrew Sloan Draper as the first commissioner, there becomes an active movement amongst the state to reform rural education. You also begin to see simultaneously a movement amongst urban-based reformers, such as Coverly and others, to examine how to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of rural schools, specifically the 1-room and the 2-room schools, which when we drive through our counties, we often see repurposed as history societies or as private residence. Following World War I and the increased urban to rural emphasis on education, where as rural students began to move out of the farms and into urban environments, an increasing number of calls for reforms created a movement towards bigger is better. While the state government actively sought to do this work, they also incentivized this work by increasing the amount of funding that was going into rural communities. Finally, for the early part of the 20th century, as the Great Depression caused significant economic problems, the idea of increasing efficiency and effectiveness became the watchwords from Albany. This led into World War II, where we now began to see movement where we begin to hear that with increased rapid movements of soldiers coming home, but also the suburbanization of many of our cities, once again, rural communities were placed under notice that they should try to redo and reform because they needed efficient and effective school systems. Led mostly in rural communities by elected boards of education, many of the rural schools were in the midst of their own independence and their own community-based education programs. They often recruited teachers from local young women or young women who were coming out of the Emma Willard School or out of the normal schools, which were designed for teacher prep programs starting at the age of 16. And they too, after World War II, morphed into our State University of New York comprehensive colleges. But what we saw in 47 specifically, after World War II, was the movement towards consolidation and centralization through the creation of a master plan for school reform. All through World War II, as part of the state legislature's movement to not only root out communists, but to also increase and reform education in the state, we saw the state legislature and the state education department create a master plan that would effectively take the one-room common school districts and centralize them into centralized schools, mostly using village union-free or academies as their central point. This led to a number of concerns in local communities and fights over whom they would centralize with. Two specific examples include Kyneton, New York, south of Jamestown, and Morganville, Stafford number 2, east of Batavia, west of Leroy. In these two communities, and especially it's important to note, the leadership of local women, many of whom were quietly educated through degrees in library sciences or through liberal arts, became community leaders in opposition to these centralizations. While the majority of the state went along with the process of centralization, we do see where the Commissioner of Education at the time needed to explain how this work was going to be undertaken. As the Commissioner of Education at the time called on the state educators and local community leaders to overcome the opposition that was seen throughout these regions. Commissioner Spalding had been a national leader in reform in education and called in multiple locations for reforms. He specifically gave speeches to rural interest groups, science interest groups, and others, downplaying local opposition and stating this opposition emerged out of individuals who were, quite frankly, not willing to pay the taxes or had very parochial or localistic reasons to buck reform. What Spalding missed was this. In many of these communities that opposed opposition, they felt that the 1947 master plan did not take into account community sensibilities, nor did it take into account some of the geographical realities of these rural communities. And as such, two places, the Kyneton School and the Morganville district, we see that they actually rejected through quite enthusiastic methods, the master plan. In Keentone, it took state troopers to get the community to merge into Frewsburg, whereas through discussions with local community members and also through archival research in the Fenton Historical Society, I found that for many members of the community in Keentone, they wanted to consolidate with Jamestown, but due to the needs of economy, were forced to go with Frewsburg. Many members of the community rejected this merger, and while approximately 2/3 of the district sent their children to Jamestown, 1/3 did send their children to Frewsburg. And after approximately a year, the consolidation formally died down and became enacted, but there was no authentic community engagement. Most of the people in Keentone continued to oppose Frewsburg and continued to believe that a misappropriation of state resources and state power had resulted in them being forced into the merger. This was very evident by the fact that local community members went on a letter writing campaign, a speech tour of the state, and requested the change to state legislature so that all communities would be involved in voting for centralization. They also asked for help from the House Un-American Activities Committee, and in fact, reached out and believed that this state power resembled communism and fascism, that they and members who were veterans of World War I and World War II had fought against. And so for the community members who looked at this 1947 central plan in Keentone, this was a carriage of injustice. In Morganville, the decision was made after complaining to the state education department and not allowing school to begin in their community in the 50s, that they too would protest. State education department, not wanting another Keentone situation, cast about for a solution. And what was given to them was the New York State Thruway Authority building the mainline thruway through the county that would have broken Morganville away from the district they had been assigned to, Byron Bergen, and instead community members were allowed to centralize with Leroy. But we also see going forward that the state education department has kept this master plan in place since it was redone in the 1950s to be updated based upon reflections and changes in technology. It is still the policy of the land. And in fact, for many districts, they have had, and for many communities, they have had frequent conflict with the state education department over this master plan. Because within the school systems, quite often needs arose where smaller districts needed to build and yet needed state ed permission if they were under a master plan for centralization or consolidation. And in fact, we still see the echoes of that today, where some districts had been rejected for the ability to build on or make significant changes. And what we saw was continuing declining in rural community populations, but increased demands from the state for technology. We also saw standards changes, and we saw the need for districts to begin to partner through the BOCES. And yet, state law still says that essential core functions of the districts must be enacted by those districts, and they cannot receive BOCES support. So after 50 years, almost 60 now, the question becomes, why has the state not truly updated this plan? Well, they have through a series of panels and through commissions, which have over the years redrawn out this debate and created extremely precarious situations for many of our small districts. So as we move towards the state's reform efforts in the 80s under the Sobel Commission and the 90s, the Commissioner of Education, Tom Sobel, does an internal work group that identifies 50 of the smallest, ruralist communities, as well as others that should be forced into consolidation. Yet rural school centralization has become the third political rail in New York, where, as with local control, the idea of forcing communities to give up their schools is unpalatable. The state has also tried through incentivization via rural school centralization additional funds to aid districts for 14 additional years and provide new building or building rehabilitation funds as a way to incentivize districts. But we also saw, beginning with the Spitzer administration and then moving into the Patterson administration, and finally through the recent Cuomo administration, Andrew, not Mario, that state legislature and state governors were looking for ways to increase efficiency and effectiveness in rural schools. And so each of the governors within the last 20 years I mentioned have impaneled a group of people to look at and examine how best to reform New York government. And all three of the panels have said centralization, consolidation of school districts is considered a successful approach. So while the state has not formally changed the New York State 1958 Master Plan for School District Reorganization, it has put out every 3 to 5 years a panel report which indicates the same goals must be met. What I would like to conclude with on this talk is one important critical issue. Fitchell mentions that school districts are a unique creation, and they are. They are both local but also state systems. And in New York, the process of consolidation requires multiple citizen votes. Yet in times when the local people's investment and belief in local government is reducing, there's a lot of issues where trust comes up about whether or not these centralization or consolidation attempts are actually in the best interest of their children. School officials need to be more transparent. State officials need to be more transparent. While we value education in the state, and we are making amends as a state to fund the districts correctly, we still have seen court cases that have indicated that small city districts are underfunded, large urban districts are underfunded, and certainly rural communities, for what's being asked of them, are also underfunded. As historians and as researchers, I would implore you to work with your local colleges for capstone projects, master's projects, doctoral degrees, and book projects for local historians and others who are interested in seeing how the intersection of state policy quite often impacts local communities. Thank you all, and I hope that we can be in contact if you have other questions about my presentation.